Why does the US have two Carolinas? North and South Carolina share so much culture and politics that most Americans don't understand why they split. In truth, the split between the two Carolinas is older than the US itself, and came as a huge relief to everyone involved. The area that became the Carolinas saw its first European visitors when the Spaniards arrived in 1512, but they never even named, let alone settled the area. French arrived in the 1560s. The English arrived shortly after, but their colony on Roanoke Island famously vanished without a trace. European attention passed over the area for another few decades, until 1629, when King Charles I granted settlement rights to the MP Robert Heath, but he too passed on developing it. With the exception of a handful of settlers from Virginia who weren't officially recognized, Europeans left the land alone yet again until 1663, when Charles II gave the land to 8 powerful men, known as the Lord Proprietors, as a thank you for their loyalty, renaming the whole place Carolina. A few years later, the first permanent settlement was laid down at Charlestown, today's Charleston, and soon after, more settlers trickled in. However, the difference between North and South Carolina was already manifesting. Charlestown and the other South Carolina settlements owed themselves to slaves and plantation owners from the West Indies, chiefly Barbados, who were seeking new land for cash crops. South Carolina offered a perfect environment for growing sugar and rice. Slave plantations sprung up all over the area, supported by wealthy businessmen, while European settlers concentrated in urban areas like Charlestown. Slave exports were as important as slave imports there. Between 1670 and 1715, over 25,000 indigenous natives were sold into slavery in South Carolina, while a similar number of black slaves were brought in. By the mid-18th century, most of South Carolina's population were slaves, and most of its white population were wealthy or urbanized, if not both. By contrast, the rural North was much less dependent on slavery. Slavery did exist there, especially for the tobacco industry, but most of the settlers were poorer. In fact, many had been indentured servants themselves, coming down from other colonies, and who could never afford slaves of their own. North Carolina quickly gained a reputation for attracting the rougher and poorer settlers, while the wealthy flocked to the south. As a result, Northern Carolina became the most populated, but Southern Carolina became the richest. A good government might have tried to heal this divide, but the Lord Proprietors were the complete opposite of that. With 8 men in Fairway, London, all with different ideas of what to do, put in charge of a vast territory on the far side of the Atlantic, was it any surprise that the government was a disaster? The Carolina territory was vast and unwieldy, and its new leaders were not up to the task. Apathy, incompetence, and overambition fought for dominance between the 8 men, while the Carolinians themselves watched on with exhaustion. Overambition won out, thanks to one proprietor, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who wanted to craft Carolina into a perfect society. Calling on the philosopher John Locke, they drew up an experimental system of laws called the Fundamental Constitutions of Carolina, which laid out plans for a strange society that preached individual freedom and liberal ideas, alongside support for slavery and hereditary nobility. This was combined with a Grand Model Plan, which tried to maximize efficiency, safety, and aesthetics in any future cities. It was a bold project for any government, so naturally, it failed in the hands of the proprietors. With communication and travel between Charlestown and the North difficult, the Lord Proprietors' laws meant a lot less far from the colonial capital. Local government picked up the slack, allowing towns and communities to run their own affairs without much need for Charlestown or London. Distant government quickly became associated with corruption and inefficiency, attitudes that were increasingly common across the colonies. Distrust and resentment of the Lord Proprietors was so bad in the North, a settler named John Culpeper in Albemarle County in the North staged a bloodless rebellion against their officials. Culpeper gathered dozens of men, jailed the Lord Proprietor's tax official, and staged their own elections. Culpeper was summoned to England and put on trial as a rebel, but Lord Shaftesbury ended up taking his side. After all, Shaftesbury admitted there was no real government in Carolina, so Culpeper and his supporters were well within their rights to resist anything pretending to be one. Culpeper was declared innocent. It was an embarrassing display for the Lord Proprietors. By this point, word of the chaos and poor management was widespread, and new settlers were passing up Carolina in favor of other settlement locations, like Pennsylvania. In a desperate attempt to attract more settlers, the proprietors rewrote the fundamental constitution no less than 3 times in 1682, which only convinced critics that the government was a failure. North Carolinians continued to resist and revolt against the proprietors, which confirmed the South's impression that their neighbors were unruly troublemakers. Another high-profile bloodless revolt in 1711, led by Thomas Carey against proprietor-appointed Edward Hyde, showed that nothing had improved in the management of the colony. 1711 would be the hardest year yet. On top of Carey's rebellion, a terrible drought struck the region, as did an outbreak of yellow fever. But the greatest trial would come from the indigenous natives. In September 1711, the Tuscarora natives in North Carolina decided they'd had enough of dealing with the settlers and launched a surprise attack. For a week, the Tuscarora killed hundreds of settlers, burned their farms, and slaughtered their livestock all across North Carolina. A large portion of the settlers were killed, and most of the major settlements were damaged. By the time a relief force of British troops arrived, the entire area was practically desolate. The Tuscarora would slowly be whittled down over the following years, but the damage they left behind in the initial fighting was immense. It was so bad that officials suggested abandoning North Carolina entirely and resettling the survivors in the South, but most of the survivors refused to leave. It was the final straw. After decades of ineffective rule, rebellion, economic inequality, and conflict with natives, everyone was fed up. Writing off the devastated North as a loss, the proprietors decided to split North and South Carolina, if only to rid themselves of an irritant. North Carolina would be returned to the king as an entirely separate royal colony. It'd be his problem to deal with now. The proposal was welcomed by pretty much everyone, and on January 24, 1712, North and South Carolina officially became separate colonies, never to unite again. Although South Carolina would finally be taken out of proprietor hands, and made a royal colony too in 1719, there was never a serious attempt to reunite them. The Carolinas had never shared much more than a name and some terrible leadership. Any lingering animosity between them faded quickly, and the two colonies were on good terms when they both rose up against the British after the Revolutionary War broke out. On May 23, 1778, South Carolina became the 8th U.S. state, and the North followed in November the following year as the 12th. Today, the two Carolinas are happy neighbors with plenty of shared values and history.